Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're ready for something completely unexpected because tonight, we're diving into a story from 12th century Korea that'll make your modern-day love life look like a rom-com. Forget Hollywood's perfect, free-flowing romance. This is the real deal. Before we dive deep, hit that like button if you love a good story about forbidden love, power struggles, and, well, ancient matchmaking methods. Trust me, you'll want to hear this. So here's the scene. You wake up in a small, humble room. The floor is cold and hard, the air thick with the smell of burning incense, and you hear the clatter of tools from the courtyard. You step out of your mat, stretch, and, oh, there's that faint but unmistakable sound of someone sharpening a blade. Yup, you've just landed in 12th century Korea, where love and marriage are a whole different ballgame. It's not about swiping right, matching emojis, or writing a cute bio. No, in this world, marriages weren't made in heaven. They were planned out with meticulous detail and strategic intent. They were about family alliances, securing social standing, and, let's be real, power. Love? Well, that was a bit of a luxury. You're probably thinking, wait, is this ancient Korea or some intense period drama? But I promise this was real life for most people in the 12th century. People weren't just hoping for a soulmate, they were looking for social security, status, and, in some cases, survival. You didn't marry because you liked someone. You married because it was good for business, politics, and family ties. Sounds like the worst dating app ever. Now, let's take a closer look at those folks behind the curtains, pulling all the strings. I'm talking about the matchmakers, but not the kind of matchmaker you'd meet at a friend's dinner party. These were the real deal, the influential people who had a say in almost every marriage of any consequence. They were the ones responsible for ensuring that the right families were brought together to create the most stable alliances. But there was more to it than just matchmaking. This job was practically a blend of therapist, psychic, and mafia boss. The matchmakers had a particular set of skills. They were masters of reading between the lines, knowing what made a person tick, and identifying not only romantic compatibility but also social and familial compatibility. When you got married in 12th century Korea, it wasn't just your heart that mattered. It was your family's position, your reputation, and your social standing. Love wasn't exactly irrelevant, but it was optional. Now, before you get too cynical, let's not forget that some of these matchmakers were pretty skilled at making things work. While most of the love stories we imagine today are about swoon-worthy moments and first kisses, these marriages were about far more complex and often hidden emotions. But here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether genuine feelings of love drove these matchmakers, or if they were simply cold-hearted strategists playing the game of family power. Were they secretly hoping for love to blossom, or were they too busy running their business of arranging marriages to care about whether the couple was happy in the modern sense? You'd think they were setting up business deals, but behind all that, there were surprising sparks of passion. Picture this. You're 17, 18, maybe even 19, old enough to know a thing or two about love, and you're told that, sorry, love isn't part of your equation. You don't get to pick your partner. You're placed in an arranged marriage chosen by a matchmaker. Sounds pretty suffocating, right? But let's take a deeper dive into the matchmaking process and how these ancient professionals did their thing. Imagine the scene. A matchmaker doesn't just show up at your house one day, scribble some names on a piece of paper, and call it a day. Oh no. They were far more thorough than that. You thought picking the right person for a date was difficult today? Now imagine making that decision based on everything from astrology to family histories to even the weather. That's right. In some cases, the matchmaker would even factor in things like the moon's phase or the alignment of the stars when choosing the best time to propose a match. They weren't just choosing who'd look good next to each other. They were calculating how the entire union would affect family standing, future wealth, and even children's fates. And let's talk about how those marriages were carried out. I mean, we're talking about a time when you couldn't just text someone to say, hey, let's meet at the park and see where this goes. There were no flowers, no grand romantic gestures. There were rules and you followed them or else. If you were a man, the ideal match might have involved a young woman who could increase your family's prestige. If you were a woman, you'd be looking for someone with strong family connections, possibly wealth or land. But love? Well, that was something you worked on later if you were lucky. Now, before you get too disheartened by the whole idea, let's talk about the lighter side of it all. Despite the rigid structure, there was something surprisingly modern about the matchmaking system. It wasn't just about finding two people who wouldn't make each other's lives miserable. It was about creating a bond that could help families thrive. So in that sense, maybe it wasn't all that different from the pressures of modern-day relationships, where people consider long-term compatibility over quick, fiery crushes. You know, it's almost like how people today use dating apps to find matches, based on shared interests, jobs, and lifestyles. Sure, there's the occasional swipe right on looks, but we've all come to learn that looks aren't everything. In the 12th century, that idea was taken to the next level with astrology, family dynamics, and what might seem like some borderline creepy rituals. But hey, they were doing their best in a world with far less wiggle room for personal choice. Now that we've set the scene, let's look at what happens when love does sneak in. Sure, it wasn't the norm, but sometimes sparks flew where no one expected them. Just like today, people didn't always follow the rules. And those who tried to break free from the system, well, they found themselves in some pretty interesting and often risky situations. But we'll get into that next. For now, imagine living in a world where numbers, family trees, and the whims of the stars dictated your love life. Doesn't sound like your typical rom-com, right? But in a world full of restrictions, this was the closest thing to a love story that could happen. Stick with me, and we'll unravel more of this surprisingly complex love game. But first, let me know in the comments, what's your take on love in the 12th century? Would you have survived it, or would you have found a way to sneak around the rules? Let's chat about it. Hey, welcome back. Let's talk about how love and marriage worked in 12th century Korea. But don't expect flowers and romantic dinners. This was more about family power than true love. If you're curious, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments if you think you'd survive this kind of system. So picture this, it's the 12th century. You wake up in a small room. It's cold. You stretch, and the smell of incense fills the air. Outside, you hear the sound of people getting ready for the day. And then you remember your marriage has already been decided. It wasn't about love. It was about family, status, and money. Back then, marriage wasn't a choice you made based on feelings. It was about ensuring your family remained strong and in the correct position. You married to keep your family's power in check, to get ahead in life, or even to survive. You didn't pick who you liked. You decided who would benefit you, your family, and your community. In Korea, when a child reached the age for marriage, families would call in a matchmaker. These matchmakers were not just random individuals but experts in picking the right people to marry. They didn't focus on emotions. They focused on family backgrounds, wealth, and sometimes the stars. Yes, they believed the positions of the stars and the moon could tell you if two people were a good match. Their role was crucial in the marriage process, as they were responsible for finding someone who would fit into your life, your family, and your place in society. Marriage wasn't just about one person picking another. It was a team effort. Families worked together to choose the perfect partner for their children. This responsibility was not taken lightly. They used astrology, family history, and a lot of careful planning. Imagine trying to find someone based not on who you liked, but on who could help your family grow richer or more powerful. No wonder people didn't fall in love right away, but it wasn't all bad. Families tried to pick partners they thought would make each other happy. It just wasn't the same kind of true love we think of today. Historians still debate whether these matchmakers ever believed in love themselves. Did they think marriage was about happiness? Or was it only about family and status? We'll never know for sure, but they did likely care if the couple could get along. After all, they had to deal with family drama, too. In the 12th century, it wasn't just about picking someone who looked good or had a nice job. People had to match in social rank, background, and sometimes even their astrology charts. You couldn't just pick anyone. The stars had to align first. If your family was rich and powerful, your match had to be just as rich and powerful. And if the stars said you weren't a good match, you had to wait. Imagine being told that you couldn't marry someone because it wasn't the right time according to the moon. Pretty wild, right? So, love wasn't the first thing on the table in marriage. Family background, wealth, and status came first. If you were lucky, love came after. But there were no guarantees. The matchmaker was so important that they even helped pick the right time for the wedding. That's right. They didn't just choose your partner. They also chose your wedding day based on astrology. This unique aspect of ancient Korean marriages is genuinely intriguing. Can you imagine how different that is from today? But here's the fun twist. Even though love wasn't a huge focus, sometimes it found a way in. Some people didn't just follow the rules, they broke them. And sometimes, these love rebels found ways to make their marriage work, even if it wasn't what their families had planned. However, it's important to note that there were often severe consequences for not following the marriage customs, including social ostracism and financial penalties. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's think about this. Imagine if your love life wasn't about choosing the person you liked. Instead, it was about choosing someone who would make your family stronger. Could you do it? Could you marry someone for family reasons and then try to make it work? I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot of pressure. But in the end, it was all about maintaining the balance of power. In ancient Korea, marriage wasn't about falling in love. It was about making sure your family stayed strong. In the next part, we'll look at the matchmakers themselves and how they made all this work. So stick around, it's only going to get more interesting. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, love was hard to find in 12th century Korea, but who was in charge of making it happen? Well, that's where the matchmakers come in. But trust me, they were no ordinary people. They were the experts, the professionals, and the power players who shaped who married whom. And before we get started, hit that like button if you're ready to hear about the most important people in ancient romance, the matchmakers. Now, picture this. It's a warm morning, and you hear a knock at the door. You open it, and standing there is a matchmaker, well-dressed, full of confidence, and carrying an air of authority. This person isn't here to chat about the weather. No, they're here to make sure your family's future stays intact. The matchmaker was a big deal in 12th century Korea, and their job wasn't just about finding someone who liked you back. It was a full-on family business with them as the CEO. In ancient Korea, matchmaking wasn't some simple task like picking your prom date. It was a business. Think about it like this. You're not just trying to find a match based on looks or personality. You're choosing someone who will help build your family's wealth, status, and reputation. That's a lot of pressure for one person, right? But these matchmakers had the skills, knowledge, and intuition to make it work. They understood the importance of finding the perfect fit for every family. Someone who matched not just the person but the whole family's dreams, goals, and values. These matchmakers were masters at reading people and understanding family dynamics. They didn't just take a casual guess. They investigated everything: the family background, personal traits, the family's financial situation, and, of course, the astrological chart. It was like a mix between a therapist, a detective, and a fortune teller. They needed to know everything about you, how you interacted with your family, what your social standing was, and even how you walked or talked. It wasn't enough to say, "Oh, this person seems nice." No, the matchmaker was looking at the whole picture. Historians still argue about how much influence these matchmakers truly had. Were they just the family advisors, or did they hold all the power? Some say matchmakers were simply there to facilitate the marriage. But others believe that they had more control than we realize. After all, they weren't just arranging marriages, they were shaping the future of families. If you think about it, a successful marriage in ancient Korea could elevate a family's position in society for generations. It wasn't just about love, it was about making sure your family had a solid future. But here's where things get interesting. The matchmaker wasn't just some neutral party in this. They often got paid well for their work. If they succeeded in making the perfect match, they were rewarded generously. And let's be real, they had a lot of pressure on them. If they got it wrong, they could mess up a family's future. Imagine being responsible for making someone's entire life happen, and getting paid for it. That's a lot of responsibility. Now, don't get the wrong idea. While the matchmaker's job was crucial, it wasn't always easy. It involved a lot of tricky situations, like when two families didn't agree on a match or when the astrology charts didn't line up. It wasn't all smooth sailing. But the matchmakers had to make it work. They had to find a way to bring two families together. And sometimes that meant bending the rules a little. It wasn't always about what was perfect on paper. Sometimes a little charm, a little persuasion, and a lot of clever negotiating helped seal the deal. A successful matchmaker wasn't just someone who followed the rules. They were a strategist, a master of negotiation. And they had to make sure both families were happy. If you think modern-day wedding planners have a stressful job, try being the matchmaker in 12th century Korea. But here's a quirky tidbit. The matchmaker wasn't always a neutral third party. In some cases, they were expected to be part of the ceremony itself. They didn't just set up the meeting and then walk away. Oh no, they played a significant role in the wedding, ensuring the marriage happened just as it was supposed to. Talk about a personal touch. So, while we may think of matchmakers today as just people who help with dating apps or blind dates, back in the 12th century, they were so much more. They were responsible for the future of entire families. They were the ones who ensured that the right people got married for all the right reasons. And, in a way, they were kind of like ancient-day CEOs running the family business of love and marriage. Now, imagine living in a world where your life choices were in someone else's hands. That was the reality for many people in ancient Korea. The matchmakers were the ones who decided who married whom, and their decisions had enormous consequences. They were respected and feared in equal measure, and their influence could shape the entire future of a family. Not bad for a job where you get to play matchmaker, right? But here's the twist. While these matchmakers were incredibly important, they didn't always get it right. Sometimes, despite their careful planning and hard work, things didn't turn out as expected. And that's where the real drama begins. The following section explores the struggles and challenges these matchmakers faced when their perfect matches didn't quite work out as planned. Stay tuned. You won't want to miss it. Now that you've met the matchmakers, let's delve into their secret weapon: numbers, charts, and astrology. In 12th century Korea, they didn't just rely on simple matchmaking. They employed a sophisticated blend of science, mysticism, and intricate calculations to determine the most suitable matches. It was a process far more complex than mere personal preferences or mutual attraction. Imagine this. You're sitting down with your family, ready to figure out who your future spouse will be. But it's not about holding hands and whispering sweet nothings. Instead, you're handed a birth chart, your family's history, and a bunch of family names that need to align with yours. This is what the matchmakers had to work with. They didn't just consider personality traits or chemistry. They looked at the stars, your family background, and sometimes even the specific hour you were born. In ancient Korea, astrology wasn't a casual pastime. It was a powerful tool that steered significant life decisions, particularly in the realm of marriage. Many Koreans believed that the stars at the time of birth could unveil a person's destiny. Were they compatible? Would their union bring prosperity or misfortune? These were questions the stars were believed to answer. Disbelief in astrology was akin to social ostracism. Historians still debate just how vital astrology was in these marriages. Was it just an extra layer of security for families, or did it hold a more profound, more spiritual significance? Some say it was all about ensuring the match would bring balance to the family. Others think it was just another tool to control people and their future. But one thing is for sure, no one took it lightly. Here's how it worked. The matchmaker would gather all the relevant information, birth dates, family history, even the time of day you were born, and run it through an astrology system. If everything aligned perfectly, it was a match. But if not, well, tough luck. Even if you were deeply in love, a mismatched birth chart could dash your hopes. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictability of love in the face of societal norms. But it wasn't just the stars that determined your future. It was also your family's social status, financial situation, and lineage. You couldn't just be a good person and expect to marry well. You had to have the right connections, the right background, and the right timing. Families worked with the matchmaker to make sure all the details were in place. It was like a giant game of matchmaking chess. One wrong move and your family could lose everything. Astrology played a crucial role in the process, to the point where even two people who seemed perfect for each other could still be denied based on their charts. It sounds a bit wild, but the idea was that a person's birth chart had a powerful influence on their personality and future. If it didn't align with the other person's, it could cause chaos or misfortune. So, for many people, Their entire future happiness rested on something as uncontrollable as the stars. Crazy, right? But here's where things get interesting. Sometimes, even though everything looked perfect on paper, astrology, social status, family background, things still didn't work out. Sometimes people didn't fall in love with their arranged partner, or worse, they were forced into marriages that didn't make sense. Maybe they didn't like each other, or perhaps they couldn't live up to their family's expectations. And when that happened, things could get ugly fast. Imagine you're married to someone who doesn't make you happy. You don't get the luxury of just filing for a divorce or ending things quietly. No, back then, divorce wasn't exactly an option. Families had too much invested in the marriage for it to fall apart. If you didn't live up to the expectations, there was pressure to stay married, no matter how miserable you might be. But here's the catch. Not all marriages were like that. Some couples found love in the strangest ways, despite the rigid system they were forced into. Now, you might think that all this astrology and family planning seems a little outdated and impractical, but here's the thing. The system worked for centuries. It brought stability, yes, but it also created room for the kind of chaos that only comes when people are forced into things. And here's the wild part. Even today, some people still consult astrology and use it to make crucial decisions. Sound familiar? It's not so different from how we match people on dating apps today, except, of course, our algorithms aren't based on the stars yet. But let's take a step back. Imagine living in a world where every decision you made, who you married, when you married, was based on something you couldn't control. Your birth date, your family's history, even your future happiness. All of it would be decided for you. And if the stars determined your marriage, would you accept it or try to break free? In the next section, we'll talk about what happened when love didn't follow the rules. What happened when people tried to break free from the control of astrology and family expectations. Spoiler alert, it didn't always end well, but it was more interesting. Please stick with me. So far, we've talked about the pressure of 12th century marriages, the role of astrology, and the strategic choices that went into finding a perfect match. But who exactly was the mastermind behind all this? Enter the matchmaker, the person who made sure everything fell into place. The matchmaker wasn't just a helpful friend or a third party. They were a key player in the marriage game. Let's take a closer look at who these people were and how they handled this huge responsibility. The matchmaker's job wasn't simple. It wasn't just about introducing two people and hoping for the best. No. They had to ensure every detail of the marriage was perfect. This meant looking beyond what was visible on the surface. They didn't just consider looks or personality. They had to figure out the compatibility of two families, everything from financial status to social standing. If there was even one tiny mismatch, the matchmaker could ruin the whole thing. These matchmakers were highly respected in society. They were the ones who knew everyone's business, often better than the families themselves. If a family needed a match, the matchmaker had the inside scoop on everyone in the area. They knew who was available, who would be a good fit, and who had the right social standing. In a world where marriage meant more than love, the matchmaker became the gatekeeper of families' futures. But the work didn't end with finding someone who matched on paper. The matchmaker's role was to make sure everything went smoothly. They weren't just setting up blind dates, they were managing expectations, controlling family drama, and, in some cases, even helping to smooth things over when problems arose. Think about it this way. If you were a matchmaker, you wouldn't just send two people off to meet and hope for the best. You'd first take the time to understand their families, their backgrounds, and their aspirations. You'd ensure that the match would bring stability and honor to both sides. It wasn't about love at first sight. It was about making sure both families stayed strong and respected. The matchmaker's job was like being a marriage strategist, a therapist, and a family negotiator all in one. Now, here's a twist. Sometimes the matchmaker had to get involved in more than just setting up meetings. They played a key role in the actual wedding. In some cases, they weren't just advisors, they were part of the ceremony. They were there to guide the couple and make sure everything followed the right traditions. They didn't just step back after the match was made. They were active players in making sure the marriage was sealed successfully. In some cases, these matchmakers weren't just advising the families, they were picking the marriage date. Remember when we talked about how astrology was so crucial in the process? The matchmaker took astrology seriously. They'd look at the stars and decide the best time for the couple to marry. Imagine this. Your entire future could be determined by something as random as the position of the stars on the day of your wedding. It wasn't just about chemistry. It was about timing, fate, and astrology all aligning to ensure the couple was matched correctly. It's kind of like saying, we're going to check the weather, the stars, and everything else to make sure this marriage is perfect. But let's be real for a second. The matchmaker's job wasn't always easy. There were plenty of challenges that came with this role. For one, the expectations were high. If they got it wrong, it could cause serious family problems. A failed match could lead to conflict, disappointment, and considerable tension. The matchmaker had to manage all of that while keeping their reputation intact. Imagine that level of pressure. If you were wrong, you weren't just causing disappointment for the couple. You were affecting entire families, their legacies, and their prospects. So yeah, being a matchmaker wasn't a walk in the park. There were also times when families disagreed. Let's face it, when it comes to choosing a spouse, not everyone is on the same page. Parents have their ideas about what's best for their children, and sometimes those ideas don't align with the couple's desires. If a family wasn't happy with the match, it was up to the matchmaker to smooth things over. This could involve a lot of negotiation, persuasion, and sometimes a little bit of lying. After all, their job was to make sure everything went smoothly, no matter the cost. One of the most surprising things about matchmakers, however, was that they weren't always unbiased. While they were supposed to be neutral parties, they sometimes had their preferences about who should marry whom. They had to navigate their own biases while trying to please both families. So, even though their job was to create matches based on compatibility, they sometimes had to make choices based on what worked best for their reputation or status. It wasn't always about what was right. It was about what kept the system running smoothly. Still, despite all the pressure and challenges, matchmakers were crucial in the world of 12th century Korean marriage. They were the ones who ensured that two families could come together and form a lasting bond. They didn't just create love, they created stability. They understood that marriage wasn't just about finding someone to love. It was about making a lasting partnership that benefited both families. And if they did their job well, both families would prosper. But here's a fun fact. Despite how important they were, not everyone agreed that matchmakers were always needed. Some people believed that the ideal marriage didn't require an outsider. After all, who knew you better than your own family, right? Some people thought they could handle things themselves. But that's where the power of the matchmaker shone. They weren't just about finding a person, they were about making sure the marriage worked. They were the ones who made sure everyone's best interests were considered, and they had the skills to handle the complicated world of matchmaking. In the next section, we'll dig into what happened when the matchmaker's plan didn't go as expected. Sometimes things didn't work out, and when they didn't, it created some serious drama. Stay with me because things are about to get interesting. So, we've talked about the matchmakers and how they were the backbone of marriage in 12th century Korea. But here's the thing, while matchmakers were trying to set up families for success, the reality was that love in this society wasn't always a fairy tale. It was far from it. Marriages were heavily influenced by family status, social position, and what was best for the family as a whole. But what about the individuals involved? What about their feelings? Let's talk about what love looked like in a society where tradition ruled everything and where women didn't have much say in their futures. You wake up in the morning, the sun is just peeking through your window, and you hear the sounds of life outside. But instead of feeling excitement for your future, there's a weight on your shoulders. You're reminded of the reality. Your marriage is already planned. Your partner? You've probably never even met them. Your future? It's out of your hands. In this world, women, in particular, had very little control over their marriage. It wasn't about who they liked or who made their heart race. It was about aligning with what was best for their families. For women in 12th century Korea, marriage wasn't about love. It was about duty. Their primary role in society was to be good wives and mothers. Their worth was measured by their ability to manage a household, raise children, and support their husband's career and family. Imagine being 15 or 16 years old and having your entire life planned out for you. No decisions, no choices, just the quiet realization that family expectations, not your desires, would dictate your life. Historians argue about how much freedom women had in 12th century Korea. Some say women had more power than we realize, while others argue that men and family structures entirely controlled their lives. But one thing is clear: marriage was expected, and it was expected to happen early. Women didn't have the luxury of choosing their partner or waiting to meet someone they liked. Instead, they were handed off to the right man, one selected for his family's wealth, position, and social connections. Now, let's pause here. How would you feel if you were told that your life's most important decision, your marriage, was made for you before you even had a say? It's hard to imagine, right? But in ancient Korea, that was the reality for most women. There was no such thing as dating in the way we understand it today. There was no getting to know someone. Instead, marriage was a transaction between families, not individuals. If the matchmaker chose you for someone, it was a done deal. For men, the situation was a little different. They had more freedom to choose their wives in some cases, but even then, their choices were restricted by family expectations and social class. Men had to marry to maintain or improve their family's standing. The idea of marrying for love was still a foreign concept. If you were a man, you might have more say in who you married, but that didn't mean the decision was yours alone. It was always about what was best for the family, and, in some cases, the community. Here's a sad reality: even when marriages didn't work out, they didn't have the freedom to walk away easily. Divorces were rare, and when they happened, they were often a huge social stigma. Women, in particular, had little recourse if their marriage was unhappy or abusive. They couldn't just file for divorce and move on. Instead, they had to endure. Society expected them to be loyal and obedient, regardless of their husband's treatment. And that's a hard pill to swallow. So, where did love fit into all this? Well, in most cases, it didn't. The goal of marriage wasn't to fall in love. It was to form a stable, socially acceptable union. And even when love did happen, it wasn't guaranteed to be a happy ending. Marriage was a transaction that had long-term consequences, and those consequences often meant that the happiness of the individuals involved wasn't the top priority. Love might happen after the marriage, but it was never the reason for the marriage in the first place. But here's a surprising twist. Some people found ways to love each other despite the system. People didn't just fall in line and follow the rules. Sometimes, even in the face of oppressive traditions, people found love in the unlikeliest places. Couples formed bonds outside the control of their families. And in some cases, that love was more genuine than anything their families could have arranged. The system might have tried to force them into specific roles, but love found a way. Historians debate whether these romantic stories were the exception or the rule. Some argue that love was an afterthought, something that grew over time, while others believe that love was a powerful force even in such a strict society. But no matter where you stand on that argument, there's no denying that love had to fight its way through a system that didn't always leave room for it. So, what did all this mean for people in 12th century Korea? Well, it meant that marriage wasn't something to look forward to with excitement or hope. It was a duty. You had to marry, and you had to marry the right person, whether you liked them or not. Love might have blossomed after marriage for some, but for most people, the idea of love wasn't what they dreamed about. They dreamed about family, wealth, and social stability. They dreamed about keeping their place in society intact. The system didn't give anyone much room to stray from the rules, but when people did, it often led to the most interesting, surprising stories. The reality of love in this society might have been harsh, but the way it could sneak in, despite everything, is what made it so powerful. In the next section, we're going to talk about those who didn't play by the rules. What happened when someone dared to break free from tradition? Stay tuned, because this is where things get spicy. It was all about family, status, and making sure the marriage suited both sides. But what happens when someone decides to throw the rulebook out the window and follow their heart instead? Well, let's say things didn't always go as planned. The people who broke the mold are the ones who made history, and their stories are more exciting than you'd expect. Imagine living in a world where your marriage is decided for you. Your entire future is mapped out. Your family chooses your partner based on status, wealth, and reputation. But here's the thing. Sometimes, love happens when you least expect it. What if you met someone and liked them, but they weren't your designated match? What if you felt that spark, that excitement, that pull towards someone who didn't fit into the perfect marriage blueprint? That's where the rebels come in. The people who didn't follow the system, who decided that love was worth breaking the rules. Some of these rebels were women who found their voice, while others were men who defied their family's wishes. Either way, these were the stories that stood out, the ones that didn't go according to plan. But, as you might guess, rebellion wasn't without consequences. In a society like 12th century Korea, breaking the rules wasn't just frowned upon. It could ruin your family's reputation. Imagine being in love with someone whom your parents or the matchmaker didn't approve of. Your whole future could be in jeopardy. The pressure was intense. Let's take a look at some of these forbidden love stories. Some women, against all odds, fell in love with men who weren't from powerful or wealthy families. Their marriages weren't arranged, and they had no guarantee of social status or comfort. These women chose love, despite knowing that their decision might lead to a difficult life. But love, they decided, was worth it. Historians still argue whether these couples were truly in love or if they sought some form of escape from a rigid, oppressive society. Some believe these relationships were more about rebellion than romance. But one thing is sure, they didn't follow the rules, and that's what made their stories unforgettable. Men, too, found themselves in tricky situations when they fell in love with someone who wasn't an ideal match. Maybe their future wife didn't meet the family's expectations, or perhaps they wanted to marry someone from a different social class. Whatever the reason, these men had to choose between loyalty to their families and loyalty to their hearts. It wasn't an easy choice, and the consequences were often severe. But in some cases, the rebellious lovebirds managed to change things, even if just a little. Sometimes their families accepted the match. Other times they faced exile or shame, depending on how strongly their families held onto tradition. Either way, they chose love over social standing, and that's what made their stories stand out. These rebellious couples were the ones who dared to challenge the social structures that dictated marriage. They said, "Forget about the birth charts. Forget about social rank. We want to be with each other, and we'll make it work." Their courage to follow their hearts, despite the consequences, makes them the true romantic heroes of their time. In some cases, their love stories even inspired others. It wasn't just about two people breaking free from the rules. It was about showing everyone that maybe, just maybe, love was worth taking risks for. Sure, it wasn't easy, and not everyone was successful. But these rebels planted the idea that love could transcend tradition. Of course, not every rebellious love story ended happily ever after. Sometimes the couple had to fight for years to be together. Other times the love was short-lived, crushed by the weight of tradition. But the point is, these people made a choice. They chose love even when it seemed impossible. And in a society where everything else was controlled, family, status, wealth, choosing love was a bold act of defiance. Now, let's think about it from today's perspective. We often hear stories of people breaking the rules to be with the person they love. Whether it's crossing social boundaries, defying family expectations, or simply choosing a partner who isn't deemed perfect, these stories are still relevant. The world may have changed, but at its core, love still challenges expectations. We all know what it feels like to choose love over convenience or to defy society's idea of the right person. But back in 12th century Korea, when it was all about family, status, and tradition, defying the system was far more dangerous. People risked their family's respect, their wealth, and even their futures. It wasn't just about running away with someone. It was about standing up to everything society said was right. And here's the thing. While these rebellious love stories might seem like they're about individual choices, they also show something much bigger. They show us the power of love in a society that tried to control it. They remind us that love can be a force that pushes boundaries and reshapes worlds, even when it's stuck in a system that tries to contain it. Next, we're going to look at how these love rebels influenced society, and how, even though their actions didn't always align with the rules, they left a lasting impact. Spoiler alert, their love stories didn't just fade into history. They were remembered for generations. Stick around because we're about to uncover how these stories helped shape the future. By now, you're probably thinking you've got a pretty good handle on how the whole matchmaking thing worked in 12th century Korea. But there's more. An entire secret world existed within the matchmaking process, especially among the elite families. These matchmakers weren't just setting up marriages, they were shaping the future of the powerful. And, trust me, it wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Let's take a deeper dive into this hidden world where love was far from the only thing on the agenda. Imagine being in a high-status family during the Joseon dynasty. Your marriage wasn't a personal choice. It was a strategic move that could affect your family's future for generations. This wasn't just about finding a good match, it was about securing power, wealth, and social standing. That's where the elite matchmakers came in. These were no ordinary matchmakers. They were the top-tier professionals, working behind the scenes, often in the shadows, carefully planning alliances between the wealthiest and most powerful families in Korea. Their work didn't just affect one family, it could change the entire balance of power in the region. But here's the catch. These elite matchmakers had to be good at more than just matchmaking. They had to understand the nuances of power, the complexities of family politics, and, of course, the ability to navigate some tricky relationships. They weren't just connecting two people, they were connecting entire dynasties. That meant understanding who had the most to offer and who would bring the most stability. No pressure, right? These matchmakers were often highly trained, with years of experience in understanding not just the social dynamics of the families involved, but also their political leanings, business interests, and personal ambitions. They needed to know everything about their clients, who they trusted, who they didn't, and how far they were willing to go to secure a powerful match. It wasn't just about making the match perfect. It was about making sure the family stayed in the game. But let's be clear, this wasn't always about creating happy marriages. Sure, love could happen, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to maintain or improve the family's standing. If a marriage didn't work out, it wasn't the matchmaker's fault. It was just part of the game. The matchmaker's job was to ensure that the family's wealth, power, and legacy were preserved. It was a calculated risk, and it wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Let me tell you about one key element of elite matchmaking that made things even more complicated. The secrecy. The higher up you were in society, the more discretion you needed. If a marriage wasn't going to work out, or if there were any issues, it wasn't something that the public or the lower classes could know about. This made the job even harder. The matchmaker had to keep everything under wraps, making sure that no one outside the family knew about any conflicts or potential issues. Imagine trying to keep a secret of that magnitude. One slip-up, and the whole family's reputation could be destroyed. But even though the matchmaker operated in secrecy, their influence was undeniable. They were the ones who decided who was going to marry whom. They had the power to shape the future, not just of the individuals, but of entire families and regions. In some cases, they were even consulted by the king himself. That's right. The highest of the high in society trusted these matchmakers with matters that could change the fate of a nation. Talk about pressure. Now, let's not forget the darker side of the elite matchmaking world. While many families were seeking power and influence, some were willing to go to extreme lengths to secure a match. It wasn't uncommon for families to use bribery or other underhanded tactics to influence the matchmaker's decisions. If a family could afford to, they might try to buy their way into a more favorable match. Money, connections, and sheer force of will could sometimes tip the scales in a matchmaker's decision-making process. This meant that not every game was made with fairness or love in mind. Some were made for pure, unadulterated power. But the intrigue didn't end there. The elite matchmakers were also tasked with managing the fallout when things didn't go as planned. If a match failed or if a marriage led to conflict, the matchmaker had to step in and smooth things over. This could involve negotiating with families, creating new alliances, or even working behind the scenes to fix the damage. Imagine being that person, constantly in the middle of family drama, trying to keep the peace while making sure everyone stays in the game. And here's the most fascinating part of all. Despite all the pressure, secrets, and drama, some elite matchmakers were revered for their skills. They were known for being able to find the perfect match, even in the most complicated situations. Their reputations were built on their ability to bring families together, even if those families had the most complex histories. They were the true power players in a world that was all about family and status. But, of course, not everyone agreed that these elite matchmakers were the best thing for society. Some believed that the whole system of arranged marriages, with all its secrecy and power plays, was corrupt. There was criticism that these matchmakers only helped the wealthy stay in control, while the poor and powerless were left behind. It wasn't a perfect system, and for every success, there was a failure. For every marriage that brought stability, there was one that caused chaos. Now, think about this from today's perspective. We've come a long way from arranged marriages and strict family alliances. But in some ways, the spirit of what these elite matchmakers did still exists. Today, we have high-powered matchmakers in the form of dating apps and services that promise to find the perfect match. We use algorithms instead of astrology, but the concept is the same. We're still looking for ways to secure the best partner for our futures. Maybe the stakes aren't as high as they were in 12th century Korea, but the idea of finding someone who will improve our lives and futures is still very much alive. So, what happens next in this world of elite matchmaking? Well, the matchmakers weren't just about making perfect marriages. They were about securing the future, keeping families in power, and making sure everything went according to plan. But when things didn't go according to plan, that's when the real drama started. And trust me, the best part is coming up, so stay tuned. So far, we've seen the matchmaker as the mastermind of the whole marriage game. They were the ones who made sure everything aligned: birth charts, family status, wealth, everything. But here's the twist you probably didn't see coming. What happens when the matchmaker, the person who arranges all these marriages, actually falls in love themselves? That's right. The one person who was supposed to remain neutral, cold, and calculated, caught in the very same love game they played for others. Now, this is where things get interesting. Imagine being in the matchmaker's shoes for a moment. You've spent years managing people's love lives, carefully crafting the perfect matches, ensuring that everyone's family stays in power. It's a job complete of strategy, logic, and, at times, ruthlessness. But then, one day, you meet someone. You know the rules. You know what's at stake. But just like everyone else, you find yourself falling for someone who, in theory, might not be the best match. What do you do now? The role of the matchmaker was one of power and control. They could choose the right partners for families, to navigate complex social structures, and even to decide when someone was ready to marry. But their personal lives? Well, that was a different story. A matchmaker falling in love was a huge risk, not just for the matchmaker, but for the families they were working with. If the matchmaker had a personal interest in a potential partner, would they still be able to act impartially? Would they still make decisions based on logic and compatibility, or would their own emotions get in the way? There's an undeniable conflict here. These matchmakers were experts in guiding others to relationships that were meant to last. But what happens when they find themselves in a situation where their own heart is on the line? Could they still fulfill their duty, knowing that their personal feelings were clouding their judgment? You'd think that a matchmaker falling in love would be the ultimate contradiction. They spent their lives trying to make the best match for others, and yet they had to figure out what to do when they felt that same rush of affection. And let's not forget the pressure. If they fell for someone who didn't align with the family's goals, or worse, someone who didn't meet the family's social expectations, it could cause a massive scandal. The matchmaker wasn't just working with their future, they were responsible for the future of entire families. Could they afford to let their own emotions interfere? This was a problem that some matchmakers faced. History doesn't tell us much about their personal lives, but we can imagine how difficult it must have been. The pressure of making the right match for everyone else while dealing with your feelings must have been overwhelming. They were experts at arranging marriages, but in the end, they were human too. And even the most skilled professionals have to deal with their hearts. Now, let's consider the irony of this situation. The matchmaker, the person who orchestrates all these marriages, might not even believe in the same love they help create for others. Some matchmakers probably thought of love as an afterthought. They were doing their job, fulfilling their duty to the family, the community, and society. Love wasn't the point, but what happens when love becomes the point for them? Would they be able to keep doing their job, or would it all fall apart? It's a fascinating dilemma, and it's not just some ancient issue. In many ways, this kind of conflict still exists today, just in different forms. Think about matchmakers, dating app creators, or even people who set up blind dates for friends. How many times have we heard stories about matchmakers falling in love with one of their clients or helping someone find love only to realize they're in love with that person themselves? It's an age-old problem that seems to follow the matchmaker wherever they go. But the story doesn't stop there. When the matchmaker does fall in love, it's not just about the personal dilemma they face. It's about how their decision impacts the families they serve. If the matchmaker's heart leads them to make a choice that doesn't align with family interests, the consequences could be far-reaching. Imagine a matchmaker choosing someone for their happiness, only to have that marriage disrupt the balance of power between families. It could cause chaos, distrust, and even ruin the matchmaker's reputation. But here's the interesting thing. Sometimes, despite the risks, the matchmaker might decide to follow their heart. They might choose love over duty, throwing caution to the wind and making a decision that defies the very principles they've spent their whole life upholding. And, in a way, that act could change everything. By choosing love, they might show others that love, after all, is just as important as family ties, social status, and all those other things we hold on to so tightly. This choice is a massive act of rebellion, not just against tradition, but against the very system that has shaped the society they live in. The matchmaker who falls in love is, in a sense, rejecting the idea that love should be controlled, that it should be calculated and planned. It's a powerful statement about the freedom of the heart and how love can't always be planned or arranged. But let's not get too carried away. The matchmaker's job wasn't going to get any easier just because they decided to follow their heart. It could make things even more complicated. But that's what makes the stories of matchmakers who fell in love so compelling. They were the ones who dared to break the rules. They were the ones who showed that, even in a world built on tradition, love had a way of sneaking in and causing a stir. And that's the beauty of this entire system. It was rigid, controlled, and all about maintaining order. But in the end, it was love, messy, unpredictable, and uncontrollable, that had the power to change everything. It's a reminder that even in a world where everything seems set in stone, love always finds a way to break free. In the next section, we're going to take a closer look at the role poetry played in these love stories. It wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was an essential tool for expression and connection. Stay with me because this part is going to add even more depth to these love stories. We've seen how marriage in 12th century Korea wasn't about love. It was about family, alliances, and social standing. But what about when people wanted to express their feelings? Where did love fit into a system that was based on practicality, power, and structure? Well, if you couldn't say it with your actions, maybe you could say it with words. Enter love poetry, the hidden weapon for those brave enough to use it. In a world where emotions were often suppressed and families made decisions, the written word became a secret avenue for expression. Picture this: you're living in a society where your family and the matchmaker determine your entire future. You can't just go up to your partner and confess your feelings because, well, that's not how things work. Instead, you turn to poetry. Poetry, of course, wasn't just for those who had extra time on their hands. It was an art form, a way to communicate love, longing, and desire in a world where those emotions were otherwise hidden behind closed doors. In the 12th century, poetry wasn't just a flowery pastime. It was serious business. The elite were expected to be skilled in poetry, especially when it came to courtship. If you were trying to woo someone, you didn't send them a text or a cute meme. You wrote them a carefully crafted poem. But here's the twist. These poems weren't just romantic gestures. They were often filled with double meanings, hidden messages, and subtle clues. Writing a love poem wasn't just about saying, "I love you." It was about playing the game, sending a signal, and sometimes even seducing the reader without them knowing it. Imagine writing a poem to someone you couldn't openly love, knowing that if you were too direct, you might face the consequences. So you layer the poem with beautiful imagery and metaphors. You talk about flowers, the moon, and nature, all the while expressing your deepest feelings. It's clever, it's subtle, and it's risky. In this world, poetry was a delicate dance, a way to convey emotions that could never be spoken out loud. Historians still argue about how widespread the use of poetry was in courtship. Some believe that poetry was mainly for the elite, reserved for those who had the education and the time to craft it. Others think that the power of poetry extended beyond just the wealthy. Maybe it wasn't as common for lower status individuals to express their feelings this way, but the use of poetry as a form of communication might have been more widespread than we realize. In any case, whether it was elite or more accessible, poetry played a significant role in how people in 12th century Korea expressed their emotions. It was, in many ways, the language of love for a society that didn't have much room for romance. But here's the thing about poetry in this period. It wasn't just about the act of writing a poem. It was about how you used that poem to make an impact. If you wrote a beautiful, heartfelt poem, it could change everything. A well-crafted piece of poetry had the power to make someone see you in a new light. It could be a way to express your feelings without directly breaking the rules. If you were smart enough, your poetry could be the gateway to a love that was otherwise forbidden. But, as we've seen before, this wasn't just a world of poetry and romance. The stakes were high. If you wrote a poem that was too direct or too bold, you could easily find yourself in trouble. This was a society that valued discretion. If someone got the wrong idea from your poem, or worse, if your love poetry led to a scandal, it could ruin everything. You weren't just risking your reputation, you were risking the reputation of your entire family. A misplaced line or poorly chosen metaphor could lead to disaster. And yet, for all the risk, poetry was also a tool of seduction. It was an art form that allowed people to express longing, desire, and affection while remaining within the strict boundaries of society. In this world, where direct emotion was often stifled, poetry was the only outlet that allowed people to speak their hearts without fear of immediate retribution. It was like writing in code, a way of saying something crucial without actually saying it out loud. But love poetry wasn't just about seduction. It was also about proving your worth. In a time when women didn't have the same social freedom, poetry was one of the rare ways they could express their desires, even if the rules of society constrained them. Women could use poetry to speak to the man they loved, to show their intelligence, their creativity, and their emotional depth. Of course, they couldn't just outright say, "I want to marry you." Instead, they had to carefully craft their words, creating poems that conveyed emotion without crossing too many lines. The act of writing poetry was a subtle way for women to participate in the world of love and courtship, even if they didn't have the same level of control over their marriage. And men weren't exempt from the pressure either. Writing a successful love poem wasn't just about writing something pretty. It was about proving that you were worthy of the woman's love and the marriage. You had to be clever, well-read, and, most importantly, able to express yourself in a way that would leave a lasting impression. If you were an elite man, this was just one of the many ways you had to demonstrate your skills and abilities. But what's even more interesting is that, despite all the rules, there was a kind of secret rebellion in these poems. They weren't just ways to express love, they were subtle acts of defiance. By writing a poem, a person was claiming their feelings and showing the world that, yes, love could still find its way into a society that tried so hard to control it. In a world where marriage was a matter of family power, love poetry allowed people to express their humanity, their emotions, and their desires. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to remind themselves that, despite all the rules and expectations, love could still be something personal, something powerful. And that's what makes these love poems not just beautiful works of art but acts of resistance. In the next section, we're going to talk about how these poems and stories of rebellion inspired others. Even though love wasn't the center of the 12th century marriage game, these rebellious moments planted seeds for future generations. Stay tuned for more of these surprising twists in the love stories of Korea. Alright, let's delve into one of the most unexpected and dramatic twists in 12th century Korean love stories: a love triangle. You might be wondering, a love triangle in a world where marriages are arranged? How is that even possible? The answer might surprise you. Despite the rigid structures of society, love, often a messy, complicated kind, found a way to break through. And in some cases, it was anything but simple. Imagine this. You've been arranged to marry someone, as per the family's wishes and the matchmaker's careful planning. But then, someone unexpected enters the scene. Maybe it's a friend, a cousin, or someone you've met by chance. Suddenly, you're feeling something more for them than you ever expected. You might not have planned for it, but your heart is telling you one thing, while society is telling you something completely different. And here's where the drama begins. In 12th century Korea, relationships weren't always about the people directly involved. They were also about the families, the alliances, and the social standing. So, a love triangle in this context wasn't just about one person choosing between two others. It was about balancing the expectations of society with the pull of personal desire. The pressure was overwhelming, and people often found themselves caught in the middle of a tug-of-war between what their hearts wanted and what their families demanded. Now, think about the matchmakers' role in all of this. They were the ones orchestrating these marriages, making sure that everything aligned for both families. But what happens when one of the parties involved, whether it's the man or the woman, starts to fall for someone else? The matchmaker is supposed to maintain neutrality, to keep everything on track. But when love gets involved, neutrality goes out the window. Here's the real kicker. If a love triangle did develop, it wasn't just about the individuals anymore. This could have serious consequences for the families involved. One person's emotional struggle could lead to family feuds, broken alliances, and ruined reputations. The weight of that responsibility was almost impossible to bear. Imagine being in that position. You've fallen for someone who wasn't part of your arranged marriage, and now you're stuck between your duty to your family and your feelings for someone else. It's a classic case of heart versus head, and the emotional turmoil is palpable. But wait, it gets more interesting. Imagine that your feelings for this other person are not just reciprocated, but they start to have feelings for you too. Now you have a full-on love triangle on your hands. The complexity of these emotions wasn't just personal, it was public. If this situation were to get out, it could ruin families. The stakes were so high that some individuals had to bury their feelings, live with the consequences, and do whatever they could to protect their family's honor. Historians still debate how common these love triangles were in 12th century Korea. Some argue that most people followed the rules without question, accepting their fate and moving forward with their arranged marriages. Others believe that love triangles were more common than we think, hidden beneath the surface of a society that prided itself on order and tradition. Whatever the case, we do know that these forbidden love stories, these moments of emotional rebellion, were sometimes far more complicated than what history would suggest. For instance, the love triangle between specific historical figures is a well-documented case that sheds light on the emotional turmoil and societal consequences of such relationships. So, how did these love triangles end? Well, the answer isn't simple. In some cases, the triangle ended with a quick resolution. Someone eventually gave in to the family's demands, and the situation was smoothed over. But in other cases, the problem was more complicated. The love triangle could lead to an emotional rift that never fully heals. Some people lived with the regret of choosing duty over love, while others made the choice to follow their hearts, risking everything. In some cases, the triangle could lead to more drama, more heartache, and more conflict between families. It wasn't uncommon for these love stories to spiral into something far bigger than just a romantic dilemma. This was a society that valued family unity above all else, and if a love triangle threatened that unity, the consequences could be devastating. The societal impact of these love triangles was profound, often leading to broken alliances, family feuds, and even changes in social norms and customs. But here's the twist. Sometimes, these love triangles became legendary. These stories of forbidden love, of people caught between family obligations and personal desire, became the subject of poetry, songs, and storytelling. They were remembered for generations, not just for their drama but for the way they challenged the rigid rules of society. Even though love was supposed to be controlled, these stories showed that it couldn't always be contained. It was wild, unpredictable, and sometimes messy, but that's what made it so unforgettable. And while these love triangles were complex and often tragic, they also showed the resilience of love. Even in a society where love wasn't supposed to be a priority, even in a time when people's futures were decided by their families, love found a way. And when it did, it left a mark that could not easily be erased. In the next section, we'll explore the surprising ways that these love stories still influence Korean society today. We'll see how, despite all the tradition and control, the desire for love and connection never really faded. Stay tuned, because we're about to uncover the lasting impact of these ancient love triangles on modern-day relationships. Alright, by now you've heard about the wild world of 12th century Korean matchmaking, how love was sometimes a risk, a rebellion, or a strategy. But you might be wondering, how does all of this connect to our modern love lives? After all, we live in a world where we're free to choose our partners, for the most part, where love seems to be the #1 priority in relationships, right? Well, believe it or not, the love game today isn't all that different from the one in 12th century Korea. Trust me, there are more similarities than you might think. Let's start with one simple truth. Despite the advances in technology, social freedoms, and personal choice, we're still looking for the same thing the people of 12th century Korea were looking for: compatibility. Sure, we don't use astrology charts anymore, well, most of us don't. But think about it. When you choose a partner, what are you looking for? Do you want someone who fits your values, your goals, and your social standing? Do you want someone who complements your life, your career, or even your family? In many ways, our dating apps, matchmaking systems, and even blind dates are not too different from what they had back then. It's just that now, instead of a matchmaker, we've got algorithms doing the heavy lifting. Let's talk about these dating apps for a minute. We swipe left or right, answer a few questions about our likes and dislikes, and hope that an algorithm can find us someone we're compatible with. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's kind of like what the matchmakers were doing, except with way fewer romantic gestures. Matchmakers weren't choosing people based on how much they liked each other. They were looking for compatibility based on family background, social status, and even astrology. Now, we're looking for compatibility based on shared interests and lifestyle choices. But when you boil it down, we're still following a system that's about finding the right fit for us. Here's something else to consider. Just like in the 12th century, families still play a massive role in modern relationships. Think about it. How many times have you been encouraged to date someone from a specific background or someone who shares your values or traditions? Even today, we feel a certain pressure to marry someone who fits within our circle, someone who understands our culture, our family expectations, or our social class. It's a subtle influence, but it's there. We might not have the strict systems of arranged marriages anymore, but our family's input can still weigh heavily on our relationship choices. And then there's the role of love itself. In ancient Korea, love wasn't always the primary reason for marriage. It was more about family and power. Love could come later once the marriage was solidified. Well, we may think we're different today, but are we? Sure, we date for love, but for many of us, the long-term success of a relationship still depends on compatibility, family approval, and practical considerations. For instance, how many of us have been in relationships where we've thought, this person is amazing, but does our future line up? Are we heading in the same direction? We might not admit it, but those practical questions still play a massive role in whether we move forward with a relationship. Even in our most romantic relationships today, we still have to make compromises and sacrifices, just like those in ancient Korea did. Maybe we're not forced into marriages anymore, but we still face challenges where love can't always be the deciding factor. Sometimes we have to make tough decisions based on what's best for our future, our families, and even our careers. And in the end, our choices often mirror those made by our ancestors, balancing love with practicality, family expectations, and personal goals. Here's the big takeaway. The structure of our relationships might seem like it's changed a lot over the years, but the basic human desire for connection, compatibility, and security hasn't. We might be able to choose our partners freely, but societal pressures, the need for compatibility, and the desire for a secure future remain just as strong today as they were in the 12th century. And in a way, that's comforting, right? It means that love, real, lasting love, has always been about the same things, no matter the century. But there's one huge difference that sets us apart: choice. In the 12th century, you didn't have much of a choice. You married who you were told to marry, and love came later, if it came at all. Today, we have the freedom to choose to love freely and to challenge the structures that once held us back. We can decide for ourselves who we want to spend our lives with, and we can build relationships based on love, trust, and shared dreams. While the ancient system may have dictated that love wasn't the top priority, today we're lucky enough to have the space to explore love on our terms. And that's something we shouldn't take for granted. In the next section, we're going to talk about how the traditions of matchmaking influenced modern-day Korean dating culture. Even though times have changed, some aspects of the matchmaking world live on today in subtle but powerful ways. Please stick with me, because the influence of those ancient matchmakers is still present in today's dating scene. You won't want to miss it. We've come a long way since the days of 12th century Korean matchmaking, right? From strictly arranged marriages and family-driven decisions to modern dating apps and a society where love can flourish in more freedom. But here's the thing. Despite all the changes over the centuries, the legacy of ancient matchmaking is still very much alive in modern-day Korean dating culture. And in fact, it's still shaping relationships today. Let's dive into how the old ways of matchmaking continue to influence the way people find love in Korea. First, let's think about the structure of today's dating scene in Korea. You might have noticed that Korean dating culture has a certain arranged feel to it, even if people technically have more choice than ever before. If you've ever seen a K-drama or heard about the blind date culture, you know what I'm talking about. These modern-day blind dates, known as sogiting, still play a huge role in Korean dating. And while it's not the same as being forced into an arranged marriage, it carries a lot of the same weight as the old matchmaking traditions. Dating usually happens when families, friends, or even professional matchmakers introduce two people to each other, often based on shared values, social standing, or career goals. Sound familiar? It's a direct descendant of the system we saw in 12th century Korea. The basic idea is still the same. Finding a match that fits, one that's not just about love but about compatibility, family, and future goals. Modern-day sogiting can even include the same detailed checks that matchmakers used back then: background checks, family history, and compatibility assessments. So, while we may have moved away from birth charts and astrology, the same desire for compatibility remains. Now, let's look at something even more fascinating: the role of parental influence in modern relationships. While we might assume that today's young people have total control over their romantic lives, there's still a massive push from families to ensure that the person you date or marry fits into the right mold. It's not uncommon for parents to weigh in on who their child dates, often offering their opinions on things like social status, wealth, and family background. You might not be forced into an arranged marriage, but the pressure to marry someone who fits the family's expectations is still very real. In that sense, the traditional influence of the family in matchmaking is far from gone. One of the most interesting aspects of modern Korean dating is the concept of marriage marketability. In the past, a matchmaker would consider a person's wealth, background, and social connections to determine if they were a good match. Today, a similar idea exists, except now, it's not just about matching people for social power but for marriage marketability. What this means is that, in modern Korea, your dating profile isn't just about how cute you look or how well you get along with someone. It's also about how well you can provide for your future family, your career prospects, and your ability to maintain a stable life. Parents and families often look at these factors as a kind of checklist when deciding if someone is a good match for their son or daughter. Again, the old matchmaking values are still there, just wrapped up in a modern, more commercialized package. Even though dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, and others have made their mark on Korean society, you'll still find that many people choose traditional matchmaking services or use services that are almost like modern-day matchmakers. These services are often used by people who are serious about finding someone for marriage, not just dating. The matchmaking process has evolved, but its purpose remains mainly unchanged: to connect compatible people who will build a strong, lasting partnership and who can contribute to the family's future. But what about love, you ask? What happened to the idea of following your heart, as opposed to making a marriage based on social status and compatibility? Well, despite all these structured matchmaking processes, love still manages to slip through the cracks. The modern Korean dating scene has found ways to blend love with practicality. Sure, people are still mindful of compatibility, social status, and family approval. Still, the freedom to explore love, even within those constraints, is a luxury that wasn't available to people in the past. It's also interesting to note that, despite the traditional nature of Korean matchmaking, there's been a significant shift toward personal choice and emotional connection. While love might not have been the main driving factor behind 12th century marriages, today, love is just as important. People might still use matchmakers or go on blind dates, but they are increasingly looking for emotional connections with their partners. It's no longer just about fitting into a mold. It's about finding someone who genuinely makes you happy. The key takeaway from all this is that the foundations of Korean matchmaking, finding a partner who is compatible, socially stable, and able to provide for the family, still influence modern dating. But the focus has shifted. Today, people are more likely to prioritize love and emotional connection than they were in the past. The influence of family and tradition is still strong, but there's more room now for individuals to choose their partners based on personal feelings, not just family or societal expectations. Even though the matchmaker's role might have disappeared, their influence continues to echo in the way relationships are formed in Korea. Whether through blind dates, matchmaking services, or simply family involvement in relationship choices, the legacy of those ancient matchmakers is still alive today. Next, we're going to look at the end of the matchmaker era and explore how love in Korean society changed when matchmaking started to fade. We'll see if love truly became more free, or if it just became more complicated in the long run. Stick around. By now, you've seen how matchmaking was the backbone of 12th century Korean society, how it shaped not just who married whom, but how families grew and thrived. But what happens when all that starts to change? What happens when the matchmaker era fades away, and people are left to figure out love and marriage on their own? Did love become freer, or did it just get more complicated? Well, grab a seat because, spoiler alert, it's a little bit of both. Picture this. It's the late 19th century, and Korea is on the brink of significant social and political change. The country is transitioning from a rigid, Confucian-based system into something new. The influence of the old ways, like arranged marriages and strict matchmaking, begins to fade. People start to look at love differently, and this time, the choice to marry someone isn't left solely to the families. It's not just about social standing or wealth anymore, it's about personal preference, feelings, and, yes, love. But here's the thing. With the matchmaker's power starting to slip away, love didn't become a free-for-all. It didn't suddenly become this wide-open field of limitless possibilities. Instead, things became more complicated. You see, once families were no longer the final authority in marriage decisions, individuals were left to make their own choices. But with that came new pressure. The expectations didn't disappear, they just shifted. Now, it was about finding a balance between love, family expectations, and society's evolving views on marriage. It wasn't all about the matchmaker anymore, but people were still very much influenced by their families and social circles. In short, people still needed to find a partner who fit, just without the formal matchmaking process. Think about it. Now that the matchmaker was no longer in the picture, what were people supposed to do? They had to navigate love without the guidance of someone who'd been trained to figure out compatibility based on family background, astrology, and social status. It was like taking the safety net away from a tightrope walker. Sure, they could walk the tightrope on their own, but it was a lot riskier. People had to take matters into their own hands, and in doing so, love became more unpredictable. Marriages were no longer based solely on what was best for the family's future. They now involved actual feelings. But that didn't mean it was all smooth sailing. It made everything messier. As love became more of a personal decision, people found themselves in situations where their emotions and desires didn't always align with the realities of their world. Sure, they could pick their partners now, but society still had rules. Families still had expectations. And in a way, love became even more complicated. It wasn't just about finding the right match. It was about navigating the conflicting pressures of love, family, and social standing. So, what seemed like freedom to choose was often tangled up with the same old pressures. Fast forward to today, and the idea of choosing a partner freely is no longer a strange or forbidden thing in Korean society. It's the norm. The matchmaker era is long gone, and love is now based on individual choice, emotional connection, and personal compatibility. But despite all that, the impact of the past is still felt. Think about how much family and social expectations still influence relationships. The pressure to marry someone who fits into your family's values, traditions, and even financial status is still strong, even in the modern age. Sure, we've moved on from the matchmaker era, but we've taken some of its practices with us, just without the same kind of formal structure. In a sense, the end of the matchmaker era didn't make love easier. It didn't automatically lead to a world where everyone was free to marry for love and nothing else. Instead, love became a much more personal but also much more complicated decision. The old traditions no longer constrained people, but they were still influenced by new pressures, the desire to find love on their terms, but also the fear of disappointing their families or breaking away from the norms. So, where does that leave us today? The end of the matchmaker era didn't make everything perfect, it just changed the game. Now, instead of having someone else choose your partner, you're left to figure it out on your own, balancing love with practicality. And it's not just a personal choice anymore. It's about finding someone who fits into your life, your family, and your social structure. It's still about compatibility, but now you get to define what that looks like. Despite all this freedom to choose, love is still subject to society's pressures. We've swapped the matchmaker for a more modern version, like dating apps. While these platforms give us control over who we date, they still operate on similar principles. Finding compatibility, whether that's based on shared interests, values, or even location. Sure, love might be freer than it was centuries ago, but it's still influenced by social and family dynamics, just in a different way. And this is where things get interesting. We're no longer bound by tradition, but we're still shaped by it. The lessons of the past, the need for family approval, the desire for compatibility, the pressure of social expectations, still inform how we approach love today. Even though we don't have a matchmaker in the picture anymore, the underlying principles of matchmaking, finding someone who fits into the right space in society, are still very much a part of our world. In the next section, we'll explore how the legacy of matchmaking and its shift over time have left a lasting mark on how people find love today. We'll dive into how Korean dating culture has evolved and what modern relationships can teach us about the choices people made back in the day. Stick with me, we're almost there. We've made it to the end of this journey through the fascinating world of 12th century Korean matchmaking. From rigid social structures to forbidden love stories, it's been a wild ride. But what can we take away from all of this? Is there something we can learn from these ancient matchmakers, their rules, and the love stories that didn't quite fit into society's mold? Let's start by acknowledging one thing. Even though the world of 12th century Korea was vastly different from ours today, some of the core human experiences are the same. Whether you're in the 12th century or the 21st, the desire for love, connection, and companionship remains universal. The matchmaker's role might have been about more than just finding a partner. It was about creating stability and ensuring that people found their place in society. But when you strip away all the formalities, what's left is simple. People want to be loved, to feel seen, and to create a future with someone they care about. That desire hasn't changed, even if the ways we go about it have. Think about it. Today, we live in a world of options. You can meet people anywhere, through friends, work, social media, or even dating apps. We don't have to rely on matchmakers, and for the most part, we get to choose our partners. But the pressure of finding the right match, the one that fits with your family, your social circle, and your life goals, is still very real. We still have expectations and cultural norms that shape our decisions. In a sense, we're still doing what the matchmakers of the past did, making decisions about who we connect with based on compatibility, status, and, in many ways, practicality. And let's not forget the role that family plays in modern relationships. Sure, we might have more freedom to choose who we marry, but that doesn't mean our families aren't involved, whether directly or indirectly. Just as in ancient Korea, where family connections were crucial, families continue to have a significant impact on our romantic lives today. Parents still weigh in on who's a good match, and there's often an unspoken pressure to find someone who fits the family's values and expectations. It might not be as formal as it once was, but the underlying dynamic is still there. The matchmaker's role also teaches us something important about the complexity of relationships. It's easy to think of love as something that happens, as if all it takes is a connection, a spark, and a good conversation. But in reality, relationships are shaped by a lot more than that. The matchmakers in ancient Korea weren't just looking for someone who was nice or cute. They were making sure the couple would fit into their families, would bring value to the community, and would be able to sustain a life together. In today's world, while we have the freedom to choose who we date, we still think about similar things: compatibility, future goals, and shared values. Sure, it's not determined by birth charts anymore, but the underlying desire for compatibility is just as strong. The 12th century Korean matchmaker also reminds us of the importance of community. In the past, marriages were seen as a union of two families, not just two individuals. The matchmaker helped create a network of relationships that would support and nurture the families involved. Today, while the idea of marriage may be more individualistic, we're still making these webs of connections. Whether we're marrying into a family with certain expectations or dating someone with similar values, we're still navigating a complex network of relationships that influence our lives. It's a reminder that, while personal choice matters, our connections to others, our families, our friends, our communities, still shape who we are and who we choose to spend our lives with. And let's not forget the power of love's rebellion. Throughout this entire story, we've seen how people fought against the expectations of their society, against the rigid systems that tried to control who they loved. Some people managed to find love in the most unexpected places, despite the pressures of their world. This is where the true beauty of love lies, not in its ability to follow the rules, but in its ability to break free from them. It's the ability to choose love, even when society tells you it's not the right choice. Even in ancient Korea, where marriage was a business transaction, love found a way to slip through the cracks. Today, we're lucky enough to have more freedom to follow our hearts, but we should never forget the power of love to change things, to disrupt the norm, and to bring something extraordinary into the world. So, what can we learn from these ancient matchmakers? For one, we know that relationships, no matter how they're formed, are about more than just the people involved. They're about families, communities, and society. They're about compatibility, balance, and finding someone who can help you build a life that's worth living. But we also learn that love is something that can't be fully controlled. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes it goes against the grain. And maybe that's what makes it so powerful. The legacy of the matchmaker still lives on today in the way we approach relationships and love. Whether it's choosing someone based on compatibility or breaking free from societal expectations to find true love, the principles of the matchmaker era continue to shape us. The world may have changed, but love in all its complicated, beautiful, and rebellious forms, remains timeless. As we wrap up this journey through ancient Korean matchmaking, think about your own love story. What pressures and expectations do you face when it comes to choosing your partner? What does love mean to you? And how do you navigate the balance between personal desire and family, community, and social expectations? No matter where you are in life, remember that love, in its purest form, is always about connection, choice, and courage. And that's a lesson that stood the test of time.